Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Teaching and Learning Conference. My name is David Keating. I've been teaching in the Middle East for 8 years now. I'm currently teaching English in Deira International School, and I also do some educational research and writing, and I'm currently an affiliate researcher with the CARDA group in Tampere University of Applied Sciences, looking at the critical digitalization of education. But today we'll be talking about the dreaded observation. A lot of teachers and school leaders have conflicting views about this. So what I'd like to do over the next half an hour is take you through my presentation. To observe or not to observe, that is the question, how formal observation culture and social learning can coexist. So as I said, I've been teaching in the Middle East for 8 years now. Observation has been a big part of my career, something that I've had a love and hate relationship with. I've had some awful observations where I haven't had any good or applicable feedback. I've had some very good ones. And I think the standard and the kind of way observations are done varies massively throughout international schools, throughout the Middle East, and also throughout Dubai itself. So in the presentation today, I'll be drawing upon data that I collected as part of my master's thesis that I completed this year. The thesis looks at formal observation culture in Dubai private schools. So anytime you see data, graphs or charts or anything like that, it's taken from the primary data that I collected. And this primary data was an online survey or an online questionnaire that 144 teachers completed, and I also did 6 interviews with teachers as well. So it's anything that's discussed here is based very much on kind of recent data taken from teachers in Dubai private schools. So the subtitle, how formal observation culture and social learning can coexist. What I found in my research is kind of professional development in international schools, and where I looked at Dubai private schools specifically, fell into 2 kind of broad categories. One was the kind of SLT mandated formal observation, where teachers had to complete a certain amount each year, and then it was linked to maybe their pay increments or ratings and things like that. And then social learning. So social learning, very broadly, is when teachers are learning from each other throughout the different ways they interact in a school day or a school year. So schools are very much social learning spaces. When teachers come in, they are learning from one another without kind of noticing it. So things like when you collaboratively plan lessons, chat in the staff room, teacher mentoring, all of that is social learning, and it happens quite regularly. So what I'm going to do for today's presentation, I will go through some of the findings from my research, give some of the interesting statistics that I collected about formal observation. I'll discuss social learning and different ways that occurs in international schools and Dubai private schools. And I'll also look at the kind of impact that one has on the other. So one of the kind of key findings that I made was that formal observation can impact the relationship between teachers and school leaders. And then this has a negative impact on social learning, because that is based very much on effective relationships and healthy relationships. So I'll share some of those statistics, and then I'll finish up by just giving 5 kind of practical tips that I found that can help kind of the coexistence of formal observation culture and social learning. So this presentation is being recorded in sunny Cork City in Ireland, but when the conference goes live and during my allotted slot, which is now, you will have the option to interact with me and ask questions. So I'm on the app now, so if you go into the Q&A section of the app, you can ask any questions that you have about anything I share, or any comments or feedback I'd be happy to have. So please feel free now to log into the app, access the Q&A section, and you can ask whatever questions that you may have. So I'll move my head out of the way so that we can share the stats. So I'll begin by looking at some of the kind of findings from the data. So going back to the title of the presentation, to observe or not to observe, taking kind of from my English teacher roots, this adapted quotation is from Hamlet, the play by William Shakespeare. And at this point in the play, it's when Hamlet is contemplating death, pain, and the unfairness of life. And unfortunately, what I found from the surveys was that a lot of teachers do share those feelings with formal observation. And this simply seems to be from the nature in which it's conducted. And as I said, this varies kind of throughout different schools in Dubai. And I'm sure if the study was applied more broadly, it would vary throughout the Middle East. But I'll just go through some of the data and some of the patterns. So if we look up at the top here, the first one, how often is your teaching observed in an academic school year? We have a clear trend here for termly observation, which you could argue is a lot, but seems to be kind of the majority in once a term. There's variations on either side of the spectrum, obviously. Some teachers were very unlucky, they were observed weekly. Some are a bit more monthly. And then we have others yearly and not observed regularly at all. This section here for other was a bit more interesting in that it kind of exposed some of the uncertainty and lack of transparency around observations. So there was comments like, oh, I have my formal observation every term, but then there's learning walks throughout the year. And there was a few comments about learning walks and formal observations. And when this came up in the data, it was something I followed up on in the interviews. And that was one thing teachers were unsure about, the difference between a learning walk and a formal observation. And I think with school leadership, the formal observation is the one that is attached to, if it's your increments, your pay or performance and things like that. And learning walks are just to kind of assess the teaching and learning in the school. But then teachers were unsure of this, and others were unsure as to whether the learning walks actually really contributed and where observers were taking their kind of data from and things like that. So that's one kind of point to look upon, is if teachers are only observed every term, how often are they observed, say, less formally, and does this actually impact them? And from what I found from the interviews is that observation in any case is stressful. Like it's not a case of that, oh, because this is a learning walk, it's less stressful. Anybody walking into your classroom and observing you and judging in any way can be stressful. So that's definitely something to be considered. The next piece of data down here, are these observations unannounced or planned? And as you can see from the diagram, a lot of them are planned. You could say the majority are planned. And this brought up lots of kind of interesting points, is how teachers perform differently for planned observation. And again, because the data was so strong here and that there was a clear pattern and that most of them are planned, it was something that I touched upon in the interviews. And most teachers, I think 5 out of the 6 did explain that there's a performance aspect, and that when they have notice for lesson observation, they're aware of the success criteria. They're often aware of who the observer is and what they like, and they'll directly tailor their lesson to the criteria, to the observer. And they use phrases like put on a show and things like that. So not that it's necessarily wrong. The teachers are just kind of playing within the rules that are set or the cards that they're dealt. But you do need to kind of question then if it's planned and if the teacher is teaching differently to how they teach every day. If we're putting all of this time into observations and they're so regular, and what you're getting is a performative kind of show rather than an accurate display of what's going on in the school, there is kind of question to maybe tinker them. So if you're a school leader and this is looking familiar to you, or any of this seems like it's what's going on, it might be an idea to kind of explore alternatives as to doing that. So that was one thing that was definitely clear. They're regular, they're planned, but a lot of them did seem to be performative from what was discussed. So I'll move my head again so I'm not blocking any data. I'll put my head on Hamlet here. So then, looking at this graph here, I asked what was the purpose of teacher observation, because really the purpose is to improve teaching and learning and improve the school performances. But then you can see we had quite an even split between the options given here. So blue is continued professional development, Orange was performance-related pay increments. So if teachers achieved a certain rating and a certain number of observations, their pay would be raised. To rate teachers simply. And this again came up in interviews, something that teachers very much didn't like, and it caused a lot of issues. So where I conducted my research was in Dubai, so it's the KHDA, or the governing body, or the regulating body, and they apply the ratings of outstanding, very good, good, things like that. Teachers also don't like being labelled with these ratings, so many teachers spoke about how it became linked to their identity, as they were the outstanding teacher in the school, or they were the very good teacher in the school, or if you got a lower rating, then that would be a tag to you almost. And one teacher spoke particularly strongly about how his school had moved away from the ratings, that obviously KHDA rate them when they come in, that's their system, but his school had moved away from that, and it was something that he thought was a real step forward. To share best practice as well, teachers coming in, seeing what one another are doing and talking about it and just sharing it. And then other was kind of combinations of both. And many of those combinations were to rate and for continued professional development. So rating was very much in there. And then in the follow-up interviews, it was clear that teachers were unhappy about being rated. One of the other questions I asked is, what are observers looking for in a successful lesson observation? And this was one of the questions that kind of was one of the more shocking responses, because I gave 10 different criteria that I would have come across in my 8 years of teaching and observing and being observed. Standard things, as you can see here in the list: behaviour management, subject knowledge, etc. And generally a lot of these you will find in observation criteria in schools in the UAE, but also abroad and internationally. And also then at the end I gave an other option, and then teachers even added to these as to more abstract things: pacing, matching the school's way of doing things, kind of matching their ethos, which again is very difficult to demonstrate in an observation. But the worrying statistic to take from this then was 20% of teachers ticked everything. So in their school, they are expected to demonstrate all of these criteria in the lesson time. And depending on your school, lesson observations vary in length. So if it's a 15-20 minute lesson observation, teachers are under a lot of pressure to be able to demonstrate all of these in that time. And I think what was shared in interviews is, if you're doing all of these in a period of time in an observation, it's probably not organic and it's forced, and then we're going back to the kind of ticking the box aspect of, am I doing this for performance to hit all these things, or am I doing it because they fit into my lesson? So that's one thing that we need to be aware of, is, are we asking too much for the sake of things being there on paper? So then those were some of the findings from the formal observation trends in Dubai private schools. So then moving on to social learning. And in the question you can see I didn't use the phrase social learning to kind of steer away from pushing teachers towards the actual theory of social learning spaces and things like that. So I just call it informal professional development, which regularly takes place. So professional development that is not mandated by SLT, or that happens more organically. And you'll see they're all kind of social. Apart from teacher self-reflection, the rest of them involve interacting with other staff. So teacher mentoring, teachers visiting each other's classrooms or lessons, collaboratively planning lessons, teachers offering support in their specialist topics or subjects, co-teaching, or staff room discussion of best practice. Many of these comments actually kind of linked back to the formal observation, and were things like, we don't have time for these, or how is there time for these outside of duties and things like that. But what was good to see was that every teacher selected at least one of these. So even if they did have an other comment where they said they didn't have time, they may have mentioned one of the other ones. So it is positive to see that social learning is happening in Dubai private schools, and hopefully happening in Middle East schools, and that schools are operating as social learning spaces, as they should. As we can see, though, some are happening more often than others, and particularly collaboratively planning lessons, visiting each other's classrooms as well. So it's good that these are happening. But following up on this then, in the 6 interviews I conducted is where the kind of more interesting things around these came out. So often I would kind of discuss what teachers valued. Was it the formal observation or the kind of social learning? And the majority of them valued the social learning more, and they felt that they got more from it. And there were different reasons for this. Issues like poor feedback by their observers, a lack of training from the observers as well. And the main issue was, for social learning to happen, there has to be strong social relationships between staff. And as you can see from the previous data, the formal learning observation, if it's done in a certain way, can damage the relationships that social learning is then based upon. So I had some kind of anecdotes from the interviews where one teacher spoke about how during an observation cycle he was observed, another colleague in his department was observed, he was rated outstanding, the other teacher was rated as good, and he said from then on, because of their conflicting ratings, the relationship was impacted. The teacher who got rated as good thought that there was kind of a competition there, and then the kind of social learning within the department was damaged as a result. Other issues that came up is the culture of nice, which is when teachers or anyone kind of giving feedback is afraid to offend if they've observed something negative. So one teacher said that he observes as a part of his role, and he often sees things that he doesn't like or thinks they aren't very good, and is afraid to give the negative feedback. And then, while it's good in that the teacher's morals aren't being damaged, that morale isn't being damaged, they're not really getting the correct feedback, and the observation becomes less productive for them. So I've often been observed, gotten very little negative feedback, but also gotten very little that I could take from the observation. So again, this goes back to lack of training. So in the data, I asked teachers if formal training was provided or correct training was provided for teachers to observe. And only 33% of them said yes, the training was provided in their school. So this teacher and his issue with the culture of nice and not being able to provide proper feedback without hurting feelings, this could be corrected with better training. So these are all of the issues that are coming. So social learning is happening. It's positive. Teachers value it. They value it ahead of formal observation. But it's not happening enough, and it's being damaged because of the relationships being damaged because of the formal observation culture. So it's kind of a cycle or a balance that needs to be corrected. So what I'll do for my remaining kind of 10 minutes of the presentation, I'll go through some practical tips. Let's move my little bubble head so you can see them. So tips to get the balance right. So as we now see from the research, formal observation is a key part of international schools, particularly in the Middle East. Social learning is also happening, which is very positive. They can coexist, but unfortunately, formal observation does have a negative impact on social learning if conducted in a certain way. So based on the data and the interviews, I have 5 kind of tips here for getting the balance right. And I'm obviously not saying to just blindly apply these 5 tips to your school. Take one or take a few, take them all, whichever ones that you feel can work for you. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but these are just some tips that I've found from discussing with teachers and from the data. These are things that could help. So the first one, to reduce or remove notice period for observations. So this is going back to the problem we highlighted earlier. The observations have become performative. Because of the high stakes, leaders feel that they need to give adequate notice. Because of this notice, teachers will use a lot of their planning time to tailor them and fit them to the criteria and the observer. And because of the high stakes nature, they're going to put on a show, as they've said. So all of this time is being dedicated to formal observations, teacher time and school leader time, and visiting and assessing and feedback. But nothing really is coming from it then, because it's a snapshot of a performance, arguably what the teacher's ideal lesson may be, but from what the teachers have told me then is not really linked to their everyday teaching. And this will vary for different teachers. I'm not saying that one time that regularly they're awful and then in the observation they're excellent. It may be that they're a little bit better or they're a bit more better, but it's not accurate. And if the goal of observation is to observe the teaching and learning in the school and to feedback the everyday teaching and learning, with this notice and planned observations, it's less effective than if you remove or reduce the notice. So that's one tip. Keep the observations more organic by reducing or removing a notice. But then importantly, and moving on to tip number 2, we need to alter the expectations for observed lesson content. So going back to the data with the 10 criteria where 27% of the teachers had to include all of those in a 20-minute observation, again, it makes the teaching unnatural. And if you come into a 20-minute lesson and it's not an observation, if you're observing through a camera and it's not being seen, the teacher isn't going to demonstrate collaboration, behavior management, differentiation, and all of the use of technology, all of these things in the slot. They may demonstrate them over the course of a year. So when I say alter the expectations, it's up to you to alter it how you feel best suits your school and your environment. But I would suggest something like that in observing for those things over the period of a year, maybe breaking them into teams, or saying, okay, if I'm coming into your lesson this month, can we see, I'd like to see your collaboration, have students collaborating when they're learning. Something like that. But as it stands, having an expectation of a 10 criteria in such a short time, you're promoting the kind of performative nature of the observations. Number 3, to prioritize training and observation. So again, the issue that was highlighted in the data was that only 33% of schools provided adequate training. So what you need to do is dedicate your PD time to training and observation, at the start at least, or for a period. So if formal observation is going to play such a large role, then everybody should be trained to do it correctly and effectively to stop the issues that we're seeing. I would advise that the training isn't just for SLT or heads of departments or people conducting observation. By doing your observation training for whole school and all staff, then it becomes more transparent. So teachers who are being observed then know more what's coming, what's a fair observation, how the rating system is done. And then in the Middle East, where roles of responsibility are a bit more transient and people are promoted quite quickly, you're not retraining then. You have staff that are aware of observation and how it's done. Number 4, to foster school-wide learning. So one of the things that from the interviews when I spoke about social learning, it was done and it is done a lot and it's great to see. But one of the themes or kind of patterns was that it's done in smaller chunks. So it's done departmentally or in the primary school within year groups. And it's great and it's sharing between departments, but it's kind of limiting in what it can be. So what I would say is not all the time, but when you have the opportunity to do so, foster school-wide social learning by kind of mixing your staff socially, mixing the primary and secondary if you're giving PD days, allows some kind of free informal time where teachers can interact in different departments and different groups to just share socially what they're doing. And it's quite a small thing to do, but the reward could be quite big. And then the last tip is to reevaluate the influence of regulating bodies in your school observation culture. So again, going back to the group that I interviewed and did the survey for, were based in Dubai private schools. So the regulating body is the KHDA. And while it is important that you are ticking the boxes and doing everything correct for the body that is regulating your school where it is, you shouldn't let it kind of control your school culture. And that was one of the things that emerged from interviews as well, and that teachers were frustrated when their schools were almost defined by the KHDA. And they thought that the school culture even changed. One teacher said that he loved when their observation was at the beginning of the year, because then the kind of pressure was off and they could go on to teaching how they wanted. And that he believed that the school culture was better after the observations. And that's not making a comment or judgment against KHDA, but your school culture shouldn't be regulated by the body, and it shouldn't be kind of controlled by, and I think it'll affect how you're doing things if it's just aimed to satisfy school observations. So what I would suggest is to train towards your observation, approaching when you have your date and when you know it, it's fine to use the KHDA criterion or observations and letting teachers know this is what they need to do. But it doesn't need to be year round. I think that's where more frustrations from teachers come, when it is a year round thing. So to conclude, and to bring it back to our Hamlet theme from the beginning of to be or not to be, I'll close with another quote from the play. Though this be madness, yet there is method to it, or there's method in it. And the point I'm making here is, while it seems madness to reduce your formal observation to improve your formal observation, the kind of key thing I want you to take from my presentation is balance, and that formal observation and social learning are two key parts to education, particularly in international schools and schools in the Middle East. They can coexist, but if formal observation is done in the way that it's done in some of the schools, this kind of intense, often in a pre-planned way, you're going to get a performative result. And it also damages the relationships that are key and core to social learning. So what you need to do is get the balance right, so that you're giving more time to social learning, that you're fostering the relationships that are going to allow for this type of learning that teachers are shown to value more. And you can break the limits that you're going to get from simply more formal observation. So formal observation is important. It plays a key in international teaching and international schools, but it shouldn't play such a dominant role that it damages the social learning that we've learned is so key. So, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out in the Q&A, or my Twitter handle is there, @DavidKeatingEdu, if you'd like to connect and give any feedback or comments. Also, if you're particularly interested in teacher observation, my master's thesis that I took the data from to do this session, I'm happy to share the full thesis if you would like. So feel free to get in contact and give any feedback or requests that you have. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope this gave some sort of applicable benefits to how you do your teacher observation.